It's time for the business news now on the programme. Charles Pellegrin's here. A little bit of a different business news for you today because we're heading back to Nairobi to discuss the financial aspect of the Africa Climate Summit, especially the big issue of how to finance the continent's full transition to a green economy, Charles.
That's right, Stuart. It's a huge question. At a global level, the International Energy Agency estimates that investments will need to surge to $2 trillion a year within a decade in order to reach the Paris Agreement goal of capping global warming below the 2 degrees Celsius mark. That's 8 times more than what is currently being spent. And when it comes to Africa and its 1.4 billion people, they only represent 3% of worldwide energy investments so far. Well, one of the major hurdles to getting more financing for this transition is quite simply the increase in the cost of financing and the continent's ballooning debt. As you can see there, a new working paper by the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Project outlines the depth of debt distress in sub-Saharan Africa, which has tripled since 2008 to around $539 billion in 2021. Money owed to a diverse set of creditors, multilateral banks like the International Monetary Fund, private bondholders, or other states as well. The paper finds that countries in the region will face debt servicing costs in US dollars that are roughly the same as their climate finance needs on an annual basis. And only 10 countries in the region have the borrowing space to finance those needs. Well, for more on this, let's speak with Kevin Gallagher. He's the director of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, which contributed to this working paper he mentioned earlier. He joined us live from Nairobi. Thank you for being with us. Yesterday, the UN Secretary General at the summit called for an overhaul of the global financial system, calling it outdated, unfair, and dysfunctional. Can you spell out what makes this system so unfair for sub-Saharan African countries?
Great to be on the show in the 21st century, especially here in Africa. Indeed, when it was created in 1944, there was only 4 African sovereign states. Obviously, there's much more than that now. They didn't do hardly anything to cause the climate crisis, but they're paying a heavy price. And as you saw from our study, hardly any of them can afford to mobilize the 10% of GDP they need on an annual basis to make themselves more resilient from floods and drought and things like that, and to create a low-carbon economy. The financial architecture needs to be able to reduce the cost of capital, make it more easy for developing countries in Africa, across the world, to get access. But many countries are going to need debt relief. They're going to need a whole reduction, and so they can get a fresh start to mount a green and inclusive recovery.
And in your sense, what are the reforms that have gained the most traction in Nairobi at the summit so far?
Yeah, there's really 3 levels of reforms that African leaders have been calling for. One, to make the IMF bigger and better. It doesn't have enough firepower to help when a country has a crazy drought and can't export anymore because their export crops are all dried up. So number 1 is expand the IMF, but make their financial rescue packages conducive to getting a recovery. Often they put such draconian conditions on a country that it takes them longer to get out to the other end. Number 2 is to expand the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank, give them capital increases so that they can provide more financing, but especially grants and concessional finance that can help bend down the cost of capital. And number 3 is to reform what's called the Common Framework at the G20, which is a framework that does provide debt relief. Right now, it doesn't get enough countries involved. And number 2, it's not linked to climate and development goals. It really just gets countries away from a cliff, but countries need a fresh start to be able to mobilize the finance for their people for a green and inclusive recovery.
You mentioned the need for reform at the multilateral development banks like the IMF, like the African Development Bank. Just as a reminder, your working paper shows that about 28% of sub-Saharan Africa's debt stock in 2021 comes from multilateral development banks. But what about bondholders and private creditors who also represent a huge part of this debt as well? What needs to change in the framework there when it comes to those kinds of that kind of debt?
Yeah, bondholders are a close second to multilateral development banks in terms of the total amount of debt in Africa. and they need to play their part too, because on their level, they have actually recouped most of their money because they charge such a higher interest rate. Multilateral development banks do give grants and concessional finance, and so they really need to step up. Our proposal has carrots and sticks for these folks. One is to have a payment standstill until they start paying. So an African country wouldn't have to pay back a bondholder such as Standard Chartered until they got to the table and really started to negotiate. And number two, a carrot. To have a partial guarantee of the new bonds. After you renegotiate debt, there's a new bond issued at a lower level of payment, but to have that partially guaranteed so that the bondholder knows that they're not going to have to come back again 7 months later, 6 years later to do it over again. But the bondholders are really a core part of the problem, and the United States and the United Kingdom especially could play a key role in leaning on them because contracts are in New York and London.
Do you get a sense in the current political climate, geopolitical climate around the world that there is room to get these reforms done?
A lot of these reforms are on the agenda for the year, expanding the IMF, expanding the multilateral development banks. And as I said, there is a regime for debt relief, but it's clunky and there's not a lot of momentum on it. We really need the Indians at the end of this week at the G20 to step up with some reforms on debt relief. What is inspiring here in Africa is that African countries and their leaders and civil society here are speaking with one voice, saying it's now or never. And not only will not helping these countries cause lost decades and loss of livelihood, but this is a region of the world that's going to be the most populous by 2060. And if they don't have a low carbon transition, it'll affect all of us across the world.
And finally, I want to talk about China, which gets a lot of attention anytime debt is discussed in Africa. Perhaps outsized attention compared to its share of the sub-Saharan African debt stock, which is below 10%. But they need to be involved in any discussion when it comes to debt relief. How are these conversations going so far? And is there room for optimism?
Sure, China did not cause the debt crisis like some accuse them for, but they are a significant part of the debt, and they need to be part of the solution. They played a big role in a G20 initiative called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which suspended debt payments until it was closed last year. But they have been reluctant because the private bondholders and the MDBs haven't been stepping up either, and so there's a finger pointing going on. Why China says, why should I pay or give a country relief if they're going to use the money and pay the World Bank or pay Standard Chartered? This is why we need multilateral action at the G20 and the International Monetary Fund to create carrots and sticks that bring all of the actors together, whether it be China, bondholders, the Paris Club, and especially the multilateral development banks.
Kevin Gallagher is the director of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. Thank you very much for being with us live from Nairobi, where the Africa Climate Summit is taking place.
Thanks for having me.